In Game of Thrones, one of the most respected characters in and out of the story is Eddard Stark, the Quiet Wolf, best friend of Robert Baratheon, Warden of the North, and for a brief time, Hand of the King. Ned is probably one of the most important men in Westeros, at least before his untimely demise, but before his rise to power as the Lord of Winterfell, Ned was nothing more than a second son. Once upon a time, everything that belonged to Ned was promised to his brother, Brandon, from his lordship to his wife, Catelyn Tully, who Ned only married because Brandon died. Brandon was essentially a better version of Ned, in some ways. He was taller, stronger, a better fighter, more confident, and more appealing to the ladies. Even Catelyn says that she was disappointed when she saw Ned because she was expecting a younger version of Brandon when they first met. Brandon was described as having wolf blood, which made him bold, and a bit of a hothead, which made him do some very irresponsible things, which ended up getting him killed in the long run. But Ned still seemed to have a very high opinion of his older brother. In fact, in the books, when Ned contemplates whether or not he should accept Robert's proposal to become Hand of the King, he remarks that it would have suited Brandon better. He was meant to be a lord, a king's hand, and father to future queens. He even says that he never asked for all this responsibility to pass to him. So it makes me think, what if Ned was the one who died instead of his older brother, and Brandon was the one to fight with Robert during the rebellion, getting to live the life that was taken from him so cruelly? Now, how I'll bring this about is fairly simple. I'll just tweak a few things in the story and try to come up with as logical of an explanation that I can for certain things to happen in this dramatic telling of events. So without further ado, let's get into it. Having said his farewells to his friend, and by all means brother in every way but blood, Robert Baratheon, along with his second father, Jon Arryn, Eddard Stark makes his way from the Vale. His journey guides him to meet his father Rickard, as he and his party travel to the Riverlands for the impending wedding of Brandon Stark and Catelyn Tully, a long-awaited pairing for a very powerful alliance. Both father and son are full of anticipation as they join together on the road to celebrate the eldest of the Stark boys. But before reaching Riverrun, word that they had not expected finds them. A letter detailing the disappearance of Lady Lyanna and the apparent involvement of Prince Rhaegar gives the wedding party pause as they consider what to make of this. Surely this can't be true, are the thoughts of young Eddard upon viewing the letter. It was hard to believe that the Dragon Prince, a man married with a wife and children of his own, would just abscond with Lyanna like this, even though men in these days needed very little to pursue their desires. This was especially true for the Targaryens, most of all King Aerys, with his cruel practices and, once upon a time, his extramarital indiscretions. But that was besides the point. Lord Rickard doesn't know what to think of this information at first. It was a heavy accusation for the Crown Prince, and he had no idea who sent them this letter, or if their information was truly to be trusted. But the fact remained that it would concern any father who loved his children to know that one of them was seemingly missing. For all he knew, Lyanna had not returned to Winterfell. But he would need to gather more information before a move was made. After setting up camp on the road, Rickard dispatches some men to look for Lyanna, sending some back north to make sure that she hadn't returned home, and others to investigate her last known location. When it's clear that Lyanna cannot be found and that no word was sent for them, Rickard decides to delay his march for Brandon's wedding and turns his attention to King's Landing, with the full intent of questioning Aerys on the possible actions of his son. Ned accompanies him, though he does question his father's intent. Was it really wise to levy accusations against the royal family like this? Rickard dismisses these concerns, though, stating that he isn't accusing the king of anything. He's simply going to be asking him some questions, and informing him of these rumors if he was not privy to them already. Surely King Aerys would not be so affronted by a simple inquiry, he tells Ned. The two arrive at the capital days later in the afternoon, and seek their audience with the man. Aerys is already in an irritable mood when he receives them. There's a chill in the throne room today that does nothing to soothe his fractured mind, and every time he tries to find some form of comfort, the blades of the Iron Throne prick him, like they often did during these times. Rickard begins this discussion as respectfully as he possibly can. stating that he received a letter compiling heinous accusations against the royal family. He speaks of his daughter's disappearance and Rhaegar's possible involvement, while Ned looks on, trying his best not to seem worried, even as the king glowers down upon them from his mountain of swords. Once done, Aerys scoffs at his vassals, asking why they decided to waste his time with such baseless claims. He did not know where Lyanna was, and to be frank, he didn't care either. As for Rhaegar, he was a grown man, and he had not seen him for some time either. Whatever he had decided to get himself into was his business, and he would not be bothered with those tales. Rickard persists, however, stating that if they could only summon Rhaegar to court and make him answer for this, then things could be resolved without the need for more issue. That proves to be a very poor choice of words for the Lord, as King Aerys inquires on what issues they would raise. The Warden of the North tries to backtrack and make light of the situation, but it's too late. Aerys sees this as an implied threat, and as king, he refuses to sit idle while vassals dare to make demands of him in his throne room. Wolves had no right to howl at the dragon. He orders the Starks to be seized and held. Rickard does his best to find a solution to this, first trying to have a peaceful argument for their release before taking more drastic measures. If he and his son were to be treated like criminals, then he would fight for their innocence and exoneration. He demands a trial by combat for him and his son. The king is more than happy to oblige. After all, this was his right. Rickard stands as a champion for the both of them, expecting to face a knight of the Kingsguard, but all sense of hope is quickly lost for the pair, dissipating in a puff of smoke when Aerys declares that fire shall be his champion in this trial. That day, harrowing screams resound through the halls of the Red Keep, and the smell of charred flesh clings to the air as evidence of the king's justice. Brandon has to be physically restrained when the news reaches him of the demise of his father and younger brother. Treason, the king had labeled it, but he found the word tyranny to be more fitting. Elber Aaron and Kyle Royce are among those who try desperately to stop their friend from marching off to King's Landing in what would be a vain attempt to get vengeance. But Brandon refuses to listen. With two of his family members dead and a third missing, with all things pointing to the Targaryens' involvement, he is desperate, not only for answers, but to have blood in exchange for his own that was spilled so callously. He almost gets into a fight with his own companions as they try to stop him from leaving, but in the end, it's Lady Catelyn, the woman he was promised to marry, that manages to make the man see sense and calm him down. If this happened to his father and brother, what hope did he have for a different outcome? Chances are, once he arrived, before he could even draw his sword, he would be seized and sent to his family in the grave. Brandon hates it, but she's right. They all are. But it does nothing to stop his blood from boiling, or his heart from aching so terribly from this loss. He stays at Riverrun, but his frustrations are very evident, and in the absence of King Aerys or Prince Rhaegar to strike down, he exercises those frustrations on a tree, hacking away almost mindlessly with his sword, letting the steel bear the brunt of his rage, and watching wood chip and splinter until his hand goes numb. But even this does little to quell the wrath, the need for retribution. Brandon was not one who forgave slights to his family so easily, and while Catelyn may have convinced him to not march off to a certain doom for a moment, that was all. Brandon, still hungry for vengeance, rides north as soon as possible, with the intention of raising the northern banners for war. In light of this, the likes of Kyle Royce and Elber Aaron, heir to Jon Aaron, ride back to the Vale to ascertain the thoughts of their liege lord, and perhaps sway him into supporting the new Lord Stark. This would only be the beginning, though, as King Aerys still wishes for more blood to spill. In fear of retaliation, the king sent demands to his vassals, Hoster Tully and Jon Aaron, asking the Lord of the Riverlands to give him the head of Brandon Stark, and the Lord of the Vale for the head of Robert, believing that if he could eliminate those closest to the deceased Starks, he could stop any potential conflict from erupting. Though, his efforts proved to be in vain. Jon Aaron refuses to kill the boy he raised like a son, especially after the death of the other. And after losing the one he considered to be a brother, along with the supposed capture of the woman he loved, Young Robert Baratheon barely needs to be coaxed by Lord Aaron to raise the banners of Storm's End against King Aerys. Lord Hoster is left unable to do anything, given that Brandon has already left. But even if he hadn't, Hoster doubted if he could have done something so heinous to Brandon. Marriage pact aside, he found it cruel to kill a man who only wanted justice for his slain family. And that's what the Tullys were all about. Family, duty, and honor. Word spreads fast across the realm about the raising of armies in the North, Vale, and Stormlands. Each is furious with the deaths of Lord Rickard and his younger son. Soon, the lines are drawn within the realm, and it's only a matter of time before alliances begin to form. After securing the Stormlands and dealing with vassals who weren't so in favor of going against the king during the battle at Summerhall, Robert Baratheon has a letter written and sent to Brandon. In it, he expresses his condolences for who he lost, while also letting it be known how much his brother Ned meant to him. He considered him like family, even if they did not share the same blood, and he was one of the most noble men he knew. He didn't deserve his fate, nor did Rickard. With their shared grievances, he says that it only makes sense for them to join forces, to give the Mad King Aerys what he rightfully deserved. Ned would surely appreciate the two of his brothers coming together to save his sister, and put an end to this tyranny together. Instead of fighting two separate wars, the men forge a new alliance to bring down their common enemies in the Targaryens. Though it doesn't stop with Robert. While Brandon has his plans to eventually join him, he makes his way down to the Riverlands first, in hopes of swaying Lord Hoster to their cause. Jon Arryn's host also meets with Brandon's along the way to Riverrun, courtesy of his heir Elbert guiding him to Brandon after the banners were raised in the Vale. The son of the oldest Stark son sends a wave of sadness through the Lord of the Vale. Even in their differences, the man can still see traces of Ned. Certain lines in his face, a coolness in his eyes, a tilt to the head even. Each of them fragments of the quiet boy who was like a son, but so cruelly taken away. Brandon has a great respect for Jon. Elbert, his friend, often spoke well of him, and any man who cared for his brother was one to be honored. Brandon swears that they'll avenge Ned together, and Jon states that he would like nothing more. Lord Hoster is on the fence when it comes to picking a side in this war, but luckily both Stark and Aaron have things to offer for his support. Brandon will uphold the marriage pact made by his father to marry Lady Catelyn. He had no intention of breaking that, even with his death. Jon Arryn also states that if more incentive was needed, his heir Elbert was in need of a wife, and offers him for Lady Lysa to marry as well. They were much closer in age, and this marriage will put her in line to be Lady of the Vale, and their children to rule afterwards. Hoster finds it very hard to argue with this, given his ambitions for his family, and he agrees, cementing his place with the rebels in the war. But the marriage was something that would have to wait for a time, as he needed to meet with Robert as soon as possible to aid him. The Battle of the Bells is the first time the armies of Stark, Aaron, and Baratheon come together against the forces of the Crown to repel Jon Connington, a friend of Rhaegar, who managed to corner Robert in a town called Stony Sept. Though luckily for Robert, the people in the town were doing their best to hide him. With their arrival, they're able to push back the royal forces and allow Robert some time to breathe, and finally fight back after being trapped like a rodent. It's here that Brandon truly lets his wild nature shine through. His sword cuts a brutal path through the loyalists, and its war cry is a thing to behold. Many of the foot soldiers can't hope to stand against him, and with Robert adding his strength to the charge, victory is almost certain. Jon Connington is forced to retreat, and the rebels celebrate their victory. Robert makes his way to Brandon and thanks him for bailing him out. Any later in his head might have been on a spike going towards King's Landing by now. Brandon laughs at this and says it was his honor. And after that victory, the only person who should worry about having his head on a spike was King Aerys. And if he could help it, Brandon would personally make that a reality. The two clasp forearms and then embrace, this one battle leading them closer to a victory and possibly saving Lyanna. For a brief time, they take a moment to recuperate in Stony Sept. Robert even goes back to one of his hiding places known as the Peach, a brothel, to relieve the day's stresses with a drink and some company without the threat of death. Brandon also joins him here to engage in similar activities. Unlike his younger brother, Brandon has more than a few similarities to Robert. He was noticeably good in a fight and much more confident when it came to women. even in spite of his marriage pact. Eventually, though, the Starks, Arryns, and Baratheons would make their way back to the Riverlands for a moment to truly seal the alliance with House Tully. A dual ceremony is held at Riverrun for Brandon and his friend Elbert's union with the daughters of Hoster. It's during this time where Brandon and Robert really take the time to get to know each other better. They'd met before, of course, and interacted when Ned was still alive, but they were never that close. But with Ned gone, all the men can do is find themselves reminiscing about him, and loathing his absence. It only fuels their desire for vengeance much more. But first things first. The wedding is by all accounts a rather joyful time, and a welcome reprieve before they move on to the next battle. The Battle of the Trident comes next, and the rebels clash against the forces of Prince Rhaegar on the field of battle. Once again, Brandon Stark is vicious, carving his way through loyalists in the name of his family, where Robert is making a bloody path for Rhaegar. The two eventually meet. The battle is close, but with a single well-placed swing of his hammer, Robert ends the Dragon Prince. The rebels rejoice as they rout the loyalist army, and Brandon is pleased with Robert's accomplishment, though there is some measure of disappointment as Brandon had also wished to strike him down himself, and deal a blow to the Mad King's family personally. A part of him had also hoped to get a confession out of Rhaegar before he died, on the whereabouts of his sister Lyanna, which still remained unknown. But for the time being, after his battle with Rhaegar, Robert is left injured and tasks Brandon to go to King's Landing in his place to take the city. The very thought thrills Brandon, as he may personally get to take the head of the man who killed his father and brother. He rides hastily for King's Landing, with the rebel forces in tow, but unfortunately, they would be beaten there. The city gates are left wide open, and the colors of House Lannister fly about the city walls amidst the chaos. Upon reaching the Red Keep and entering the throne room, flanked by northern men and his companions from the Vale, Brandon is greeted by the sight of Jaime Lannister atop the Iron Throne, and the body of King Aerys at its feet. Brandon demands to know if Jaime did this, as the Lannister makes his way down from the iron chair. The blonde man nods, flashing his bloodied sword as proof, and Brandon simply hums in acknowledgement. As he surveys the scene, there is a notable lack of disapproval or contempt in his eyes. While he may have had his qualms about a Kingsguard turning on his king and breaking his oath, the Lord of Winterfell felt nothing for Aerys, and would not shed any tears for him either. Though, once again, if he was irritated by anything, it was the fact that he personally couldn't see to the old man's death himself, and make him scream like his father and brother had that fateful day. During this time, Jaime asks if Brandon intends to take the throne for himself. It's noticeably vacant, with the king now ruling from the floor. Brandon considers this for a moment, looking from the men and his friends, the body of King Aerys, and then the mountain of swords they called a throne. Wouldn't that be something? The king had spurned the Starks, tried to destroy their family, and now one had not only helped to defeat him, but might even take his place as well. It was a tempting thought, truly, the notion of being King Brandon. But it was also thoughts of Robert that prevented him from doing so. The Lord of Storm's Inn had announced his plan to take the throne for himself during the war, and Brandon did not wish to make him an enemy for ambition's sake, though he truly could. But perhaps more than that, what stays his hand the most is thoughts of his brother Eddard. He was friends with Robert. They were brothers without blood, and he doubted he would be pleased with him making an enemy of him. In some ways, he views it as dishonoring his brother's memory, and as brash of a man as he is, he loved his family dearly. So he firmly says no, and that he's going to hold on to it for Robert. In the time they wait, Brandon does inquire about why Jaime broke his oath to King Aerys. He demands an explanation for this, and Jaime hesitates for a moment, but upon seeing the genuine inquiry in Brandon's eyes, this lack of judgment and shame and guilt, a true desire to know with no contempt behind it, something in Jaime seems to open, at the idea that someone actually wants to listen instead of jump to a conclusion. So he decides to tell Brandon the truth. It's horrifying what Brandon has to hear. The fact that Aerys had been planning to do what he'd done to his father on such a large scale. As soon as Robert arrives, he's made aware of the situation, and with the help of House Lannister, They manage to find any remaining pyromancers in the city, and through them, the catches of wildfire that were meant to be used in Aerys' plot. Jaime is hailed as the hero of the city, and a man of true honor for disposing of King Aerys now. Though this title does ring slightly hollow for the Kingslayer, after seeing the bodies of Elia and her children with Rhaegar. Some of the only innocents in this conflict, people he failed to protect. Brandon, however, has a mix of emotions. He does view what happened as a tragedy, but at the same time, he knew on some level that this would be necessary for Robert to cement his reign. He doesn't have as strong as a reaction to this like his brother Ned might have. For him, it's not something worth falling out over. He and Robert weren't that close to begin with anyway. While he does recommend, for honor's sake, that Tywin has some kind of repercussions for this act, when Robert refuses, he hardly feels slighted given their different relationship. But once this is done, Brandon is dispatched by the new king to lift the siege on Stannis, and from there, Brandon finds his way to the Tower of Joy, after getting wind that Lyanna might reside there. As one might expect, a fight ensues, and while a more capable fighter than his younger brother, even Brandon Stark is no match for the Sword of the Morning. Luckily for him, however, Howland Reed happens to be nearby, and with a well-placed blade, he manages to save Brandon's life. Now able to finally meet his sister, Brandon ascends the steps to the Tower of Joy, where he's faced with another harrowing reality. His sister on death's door, and a young baby boy. In her last moments, she manages to convey the truth about what happened to her older brother, and also asks for him to look after her son. This revelation is something that breaks Brandon's heart, but also enrages him greatly. The knowledge that their father and brother died because she ran off with Rhaegar is not an easy thing for him to reconcile. But in light of her impending death, Brandon somehow manages to temper himself, and doesn't have it in him to admonish her in her final moments. And as he looks down at the young boy in his arms, he can't even bring himself to entertain the thought of exposing him to Robert, especially after seeing what happened to the other Targaryen children. So he resolves to keep the secret as best as he can, before taking his sister home to be buried, and the boy, who would later be named Ned, to be raised with his family. Catelyn also arrives at Winterfell sometime later with her own child by Brandon, born some months before the war concluded, a boy named Torrhen. She doesn't take kindly to the presence of Brandon's other son, but for the time being, she has no choice but to deal with him. Brandon refuses to send him away, or divulge much information about his mother. He simply says that he fathered him on some woman from Stony Sept after the Battle of the Bells. In spite of this, however, the years would pass in relative peace for the two of them, and over the years they would welcome 3 more children into their family. A girl named Sarah, and 2 sons by the name of Rickon and Cregan. The oldest of Brandon's children, Torrhen and Sarah, look just like their father, with his dark hair and gray eyes, while the youngest favor their mother with her red tully hair. The children all seem to get along together rather well, especially the eldest. Torrhen and Sarah have a particular fondness for their half-brother Ned. They often played together as children, competing and even training together as they got older. By all accounts, the Stark family was at peace during these passing years. Though sometime later, King Robert would make a journey north to see Brandon Stark for a very important matter. Robert is accompanied by his wife Cersei Lannister, her brother the Kingslayer, and his oldest son Joffrey. While his Hand of the King, Jon Arryn of the Vale, resides in King's Landing overseeing the realm while he's gone. Despite being up there in age, he is still alive, and for now, makes do with what time he has left. With Lysa tucked away in the Vale with her husband Elbert, his heir, who he named Castellan of the Eyrie after taking up Robert's proposition, he remains far from her reach and harm as a result. So when Robert makes an offer to Brandon, it's not for a promotion, but a marriage pact. Robert wishes for his son Joffrey to marry Brandon's daughter Sarah, as a way to finally make good on the old Stark Baratheon promise. Brandon practically leaps at the opportunity to accept Robert's offer of a marriage pact. The idea of his daughter being a future queen is something any lord might welcome. Though when the king turns back to go to King's Landing, the Starks do not accompany the royal party. As it stands, there's really no place for them in the capital. Sarah, maybe as a foster until the time comes to wed the king's son, but not the others. there are no vacant positions on the small council for Brandon to fill, nor is there a real reason for Brandon to be considered for any of these positions either. Unlike Ned, he doesn't have that closeness with Robert, the kind that makes the king believe that he'll be a valued asset without any question whatsoever. And even if Jon Arryn wasn't alive, Brandon seemed to be more of a warrior than someone adept at governance, somewhat similar to Robert himself. So the Starks don't really have a reason to journey south. Brandon even opts to keep Sarah at Winterfell for the time being as a result of that, not too comfortable with sending her to the capital without any of her family there. So they decide to wait until the time for marriage. The king and his party leave Winterfell, and thankfully there are no incidents involving children falling from towers. For now, the realm is at peace, but only time would tell how long this lasts. So that's about all I have for this video. I know this doesn't deviate too heavily from the main timeline with Brandon being alive right now, but that's mainly because I think the early parts of the story, like Robert's rebellion and what would be the start of the main timeline, doesn't deviate too much with a few exceptions, even if Brandon is here. Obviously, certain characters who died before live now, like Eddard Arryn, who gets to marry Lysa instead of Jon Arryn. And since he's more of a roadblock and can keep Lysa in the Vale, Jon Arryn is still around to work with Robert, which may or may not cause problems for the Lannisters down the line. The Starks also get to stay safe in the north for now, and I do still think they get their direwolves in this timeline, in case you all are wondering about that. But other than that, I don't see a great many deviations, at least to start out with. Deeper in the timeline, I do think Ned's absence would be felt more, but this is all I got for you guys today. I still hope you all enjoyed it though. Don't forget to like, subscribe, give me your thoughts down below, and I will see you all next time.